Community Church of New York, once the Church of the Messiah, has moved several times but has always been located in Manhattan. Founded as Second Unitarian and Congregational Church, our first building was on the corner of Prince and Mercer. Mirroring much of the city's population, it was founded on the southern tip of the island and moved uptown over time. Most of our members also live in Manhattan, with some in other boroughs and a few farther flung. Our shared home is on 35th between Park and Madison, at the edges of Murray Hill and Midtown. It's good to know your place. Manhattan and New York City, by extension, is rich in a history so fascinating, we still haven't captured it all, even with so many volumes of books and documentaries and podcasts and films dedicated to this subject. But for all the stories told, that of the original people of this land remains uncommon in our collective memory. There are ways in which we still don't know our place. There is, though, a single story every child can tell you. It boils down to something like, the colonists bought Manhattan for $60, or $260, or some other irrelevant and more to the point, laughable amount. Depending on the kid, the point of the story could be, those colonists got a great deal. Or it might be, those Indians didn't know what they were doing. Or possibly, the colonists took advantage of those unsuspecting people. Regardless, the story has been passed down for generations and has made its way into an almost pre-conscious American understanding of ourselves and our history. In recognition of the holiday this weekend, the one slowly shifting from Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day, I've decided to pull the thread of that old story, because if anyone should know the truth of it, it's the people currently occupying the island of Manhattan. It is on us to know our place. So let's go back, all the way back. 15,000 years ago, people were living all over what's now considered North and South America. We are sure that they were here 15,000 years ago. There's actually reason to believe they were here 20,000 years ago. And for those next 20,000 years, these people built homes with increasing sophistications, had babies and educated themselves, and grew and caught and collected and hunted food. There were countless languages and religious traditions and educational systems and cultures. There were wars and treaties, tremendous harvests and famines, and generations of people who grew and lived in these ancient civilizations. Here in New York, the people called themselves the Lenape. The Lenape spoke an Algonquin language in which the word Lenape translates to the people. The Lenape covered a large area from Long Island, almost as far north as Albany, and into New Jersey. They lived up and down the river, and while they were one people, they also subdivided into many smaller groups, like the Lenni Lenape, meaning true people. It is possible you've heard of them, called the Delaware Indians. This was an English name given to them after the first governor in Virginia. It's no longer considered appropriate, although it is sometimes still used. The Lenape we're talking about today lived on the island they called Manhattan. It was rich in fruit and nuts, with very fertile soil. There were many birds and animals, including beavers, otters, seals, whales, dolphins. Shellfish were abundant. There were huge orchards filled with apple, pear, and cherry trees, and the water, aside from being beautiful, let them establish themselves as fishers, ensuring there would always be food even in winter. Lenape structures were more matriarchal than ours are today and more communal. They did have an understanding of ownership, but it was trumped by the notion of sharing. People survived based on their ability to work together, and it was commonly noted that when someone was sharing something, they generally saved the smallest or worst part for themselves. Generosity was integral to the culture. Verrazano showed up in what we call the 16th century, but didn't stay long. Henry Hudson arrived at the start of the 17th century in 1609, and he stuck around for a bit as he explored the river, following it as far north as he could, establishing trade along the way. Sailing for the East Dutch India Company, Hudson didn't find a trade route to Asia, but he did discover something he knew his employers would appreciate: furs. Fur was big in Europe, and animals were scarce. Hudson found the people on Manhattan Island to be great hunters, generous with their trade deals, and welcoming to new people. He went home to celebrate his newly discovered source. Upon hearing the good news, the Dutch sent 30 families to claim space and establish a Dutch presence while they were deciding what to do. Those 30 families fanned out, covering land from Long Island, Brooklyn, Queens, Staten Island, through Manhattan and the Bronx, as far north as Albany, as far east as Hartford, although they didn't hold all that land in any meaningful way. The Dutch quickly sent more ships with more people to work this new land, an extension of the company. The Lenape were usually glad to have them, although there were a few skirmishes, started generally from miscommunications. In 1624, Peter Minuit was sent to govern the new land. They were already calling it New Amsterdam and had claimed it for the Netherlands. In an attempt to organize and create some clear boundaries, Minuit decided to purchase the land from the Lenape. He offered a deal. The plaque in Inwood Hill Park commemorating the sale says, and I'm quoting, according to legend, on this site of the principal Manhattan Indian village, Peter Minuit in 1626 purchased Manhattan Island for trinkets and beads, then worth about 60 guilders. While it's not entirely clear, what we can discern today is that Minuit, coming from a corporate and capitalist culture, believed he was buying the land called Manhattan for his company, which would then own it and determine how it was to be used. The person representing the Lenape seems to have been under the impression that he was entering a treaty or deal with the Dutch trading company to allow undisturbed things like hunting, fishing, living, growing, gathering. Because the Lenape didn't have an understanding of land ownership, selling it wouldn't have been in their frame of reference. They did, though, understand landed boundaries and that peoples needed to outline partnerships and shared spaces. Without both sides understanding the parameters of the agreement, no sale was actually closed. This is why there are so many letters to Minuit and to the company complaining, from Minuit to the company complaining that people stayed, even though they no longer owned the land. He was frustrated by their non-compliance. During a meeting of the New Amsterdam Council, there was much discussion about what to do. Now, 36 years after the sale, they were befuddled. Why are the people not leaving when they had sold the land decades before? A formal complaint was issued. The Lenape responded to the complaint, clarifying they hadn't actually sold the land, just, and I'm quoting, the grass on it. Regardless of their rootedness, though, the Dutch, and soon the English, did successfully push the Lenape off their land. Through their unapologetic building and establishing of European culture, the Lenape found themselves moving farther north and west, each time settling and being pushed again. Today, Lenape are found largely as far west as Oklahoma and as far north as Ontario, with only a handful left in New York City. They still talk about Manhattan as their home, the place they lived for 15 to 20,000 years. Even if they are currently far away, they still know their place, and it is here. The Lenape strove to live gently on the land, but their mark is still felt. In many ways, this is still their place. The land, even with American culture having taken over, still bears original footprints. What is now Broadway was their trade route. It was a well-worn pathway, almost 3 people wide. In other words, it was broad, and it led all the way up to what is now Boston. Pearl Street was where they got their oysters, later paved with oyster shells, thus the name Pearl Street. Cherry Street was the Lenape cherry orchard. Washington Square serves roughly the same purpose today that it did for the Lenape 500, 1,000, 2,000, 10,000 years ago. It was a gathering spot, a marketplace, a cultural hub where people played games and listened to music. Even when we think we know, we don't always know our place. Astor Place was an even larger Lenape gathering space, used often for intertribal meetings. There were councils, games, trade, burials. In 1870, the influential Sioux leader, Red Cloud, went to Astor Place to make an appeal to the public from the stage at Cooper Union, continuing a millennia-old tradition of oratory on that spot. He knew what he was doing, and he was intentional about where he was making his appeal. I'm telling you all of this so we can know our place. What is this land we stand on? Who was here before? What wounds and scars, what stories and songs are born by this land? Living without history leaves us unmoored and vulnerable. This isn't about inspiring guilt or some kind of liberal, self-righteous anger. I'm telling the story so we know who we are, so we know where we are. We know the story of our land, of the people who for millennia lived and loved and died and are buried here. When we have children, we tell them the story of our family. We talk about grandparents and great-grandparents, what they did for a living, where they were born, where they died, whether they went to school. We connect our children with their ancestors so that we as adults feel tethered, connected to a larger story. As we get older, we understand our family histories in some larger historical context. Decisions weren't made in a vacuum. There were political, economic, and social realities on which those decisions were based. The more we know about those who came before us, the more grounded we feel in our own stories. Today, my task is to connect us to our own history. Part of that is the history of this holiday. The first Columbus Day celebration was in 1792, the 300th anniversary of Columbus landing in what we now call the Americas. In 1869, the marginalized Italian population in San Francisco celebrated Columbus as a way of bringing Italian heritage into mainstream American culture. The Knights of Columbus pushed for a national observance of the day in 1934 as a way to align Italian and American culture, trying to tell a shared story so that Italian immigrants might be welcomed. Columbus Day became a federal holiday in 1972. It's not so long ago. For many Native Americans, the day has always represented a celebration of violence, even of genocide. There were 75 million people here when Columbus arrived, speaking countless languages. They had many cultures, many histories, many religious practices. European colonists did all they could to eradicate those peoples, and the celebration of that is a continued celebration of trauma. South Dakota became the first state to rename the holiday in 1990. Alabama, Alaska, Hawaii, Idaho, Maine, Michigan, Minnesota, New Mexico, North Carolina, Oklahoma, Oregon, Vermont, and Wisconsin have all shifted from calling the second Monday in October Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. We haven't formally made this change here in New York. When I look at some of the states that have, I wonder if the people there are more likely to know their place. Those in New Mexico, South Dakota, Hawaii, Minnesota, Alaska, and Oklahoma might be more connected to their own histories than we in New York are. I was born in New York, but until a few years ago, I hadn't ever heard the word Lenape. As a kid, I was brought to the places my parents wanted to be part of my understanding of our place. I spent a good deal of time on the Lower East Side and in the Bronx. And we visited the Statue of Liberty and Broadway and museums and famous restaurants, but we didn't know our place. We didn't know that for as long as 20,000 years, people lived here on this land. They'd largely been erased. Now we know better. So we will reclaim this history and shift the Lenape back into our collective memory. We will remember that for more than 15,000 years, there were people here on this land, living in this place, sharing this island with an abundance of plants and animals, surrounded by teeming life. Generations of Lenape established deep-rooted culture here, spoke a common language, lived and loved and died right here. They too are our ancestors, the ancestors of our common place, needing to be brought back into our collective memory. They are the people who went before us, whose history we need to retain, both because it is the very least we can do, and because we know where we are going and who we are best when we know where we have come from and who has come before us. And there's another reason. It is just, and it is grounding, and it's an act of love. It's time for us to see, to know, to remember those who came before. It's how we live in love. Forgetting, ignoring, pretending, dismissing. This is not who we are. It's not who we want to be. It is our religious task to see and know and accept and embrace. We are a people of love. That's the spiritual challenge. And a challenge it is as we live and work and play on an island so built up, the image of cherry trees and whales feels almost surreal. But there were people here, and those people still exist. We've pushed them far away, nearly entirely out of our frame of reference. We don't see them anymore. They do exist, and they are our people, and this is their place. Knowing that, telling their stories, we do this because it's how we live in love, how we begin to heal the wounds of displacement. We reclaim our history because, like all history, it is also our present. New York hasn't demonstrated much willingness to embrace Indigenous Peoples Day, but it is time for all of us to love so well we know our place.